If a fetus could speak, as most certainly it cannot, lacking sufficient level of development, might it, like one encumbered chattel property in commerce before the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court, rise to say, "Gimme free"? Many provocative issues that become the topic of political debate are often polarized to simplistic extremes. None more exemplary of this characteristic than the issue of abortion, defining a political divide between those who advocate for what has been popularly described as protection of a woman's right to choose, a mere medical procedure, placed in juxtaposition to those who might deny that right to choose in violence against women. But any thinking person, not just the general masses, should certainly contemplate the thought in an elevated discourse that very few complex issues, especially involving science, and definitely post a pandemic crisis where a biological particle with but a mere expectancy of lifelike qualities, including that of reproduction, are impossible without uniting with a living host, are quite that simple. Finding even the esteemed Dr. Anthony Fauci even opining whether its origins we may ever know. And at least according to Don Beyer Jr., a staunch advocate for abortion, endorsed by Planned Parenthood, and the overwhelmingly popularly elected representative for Virginia's 8th Congressional District, in defense of his sponsorship of the Humane Cosmetics Act, which would prevent any harm suffered to animals in the research and development of cosmetic goods. We can judge a society by how it treats its most vulnerable, affirming that he is a believer spurred by the writings of the moral philosopher Peter Singer, an advocate for infanticide, that we can and should extend these values to all species. And more than a few of his supporters are proud to be providers for rescue dogs and other animals. But on the topic of a woman's right to choose an abortion, a fetus is essentially nothing more than a woman's property, subject to any choice she so desires, even for the termination in what has been described as merely a medical procedure. If a fetus could speak, however, as most certainly it cannot, lacking sufficient level of development in commerce before the justices of the United States Supreme Court, rise to say, like Sinke, "Give me free." What do you think? We'd like to know. Yet in 1841, events recalled even in a popular film, John Quincy Adams had argued a case before the U.S. Supreme Court that there is another consideration growing out of this part of the case which necessarily rises in judgment, arguing that it is observable that the United States, in their original claim, filed it in the alternative to have the Negroes, if slaves, and Spanish property restored to their proprietors, or if not slaves, but Negroes, humans, persons who had been transported from Africa in violation of the laws of the United States and brought into the United States contrary to the same laws, then the court should pass in order to enable the United States to remove such persons, not just property, to the coast of Africa, to be delivered there to such agents as may be authorized to receive and provide for them. A very progressive thought. And it was his considered opinion, even when portrayed by the actor Anthony Hopkins in a popular film, that when the Amistad had arrived, she was in possession of these Negroes, asserting their freedom, and in no sense could they possibly have intended to import themselves here as slaves for the sale as slaves, arguing that the order of the district court is unmaintainable and must be reversed. And most movie audiences in a more modern society today might render cheers for this character at an age where slaves had been considered nothing more than mere property for transport and commerce, to have risen above his time to articulate this recognition of humanity for those who were treated and sold as slaves. If a fetus could speak, however, today, as most certainly it cannot, lacking sufficient level of development, might it, like one encumbered chattel property before the Amistad in commerce, before the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court, rise to say, "Give me free"? What do you think? We'd like to know. The march of progress continued, and the year was 1970. The rise of a welfare state 3 years before a landmark case would transform the issue of abortion into a defining partisan divide. And in an increasingly welfare-oriented state, it was a case of entitlements, specifically welfare program benefits, that had been terminated, that had given rise to a footnote 4 by Justice Brennan, delivering the opinion of the majority, stating that it may be realistic today to regard welfare entitlements as more like property than a gratuity and privilege, and suggesting further that the entire society today is built around these entitlements, listing an example to wit, the automobile dealer and his franchise, the doctor and the lawyer and their professional licenses, the worker and his union membership, contract, and pension rights, and even the executive and his contract and stock options. All just business, concluding that all are devices to aid security and independence. And it is in this case, as some law students are made very aware, was the first instance where the U.S. Supreme Court had acknowledged in liberal construction what has been described as a living document to grant the existence of a property-like right arising from a government entitlement program benefit to which, under the Due Process Clause, some level of due process was to be afforded when in jeopardy of deprivation. If a fetus could speak, however, as most certainly it cannot, lacking sufficient level of development or a voice, might it, like one encumbered slave, chattel property before the Amistad in commerce, before the justices of the Supreme Court rise to say, "Give me free"? What do you think? We'd like to know. However, on the issue of abortion, despite the obvious expectancy of life characteristics of a fetus, which to a mathematical and scientific certainty shall inevitably result in the development of a person to whom an equal protection, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, today codified at 42 U.S.C. 1981, Congress, a legislative body to which the courts have traditionally granted deference, has determined shall have the same right in every state and territory to make and enforce contracts, to sue, be parties, give evidence, and to the full and equal benefits of all laws and proceedings for security of their persons and their property as is enjoyed by white citizens. No such similar solicitous treatment has yet been recognized for equal protection and importance to a mere entitlement program benefit, for that is certainly at least person-like entity, even by those who recognize rights for animals, who Congressman Byer has described as society's most vulnerable creatures, deserving protection. Yet if a fetus could speak, and certainly dogs and cats do not, if a fetus could speak, as most certainly it cannot, lacking a sufficient level of development, might it, like one encumbered chattel property aboard the Amistad in commerce, before the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court rise to say, "Give me free"? What do you think? We'd like to know. In 1856, the justices of the Supreme Court had considered the matter of Dred Scott v. John F.A. Sanford, had determined that the status or condition of a person of African descent depended on the laws of the state in which he resided. Situation very similar in the post-op decision political environment regarding those properties described as fetuses by some. And for those of the history not yet forgotten, familiarity. Dred Scott had been described by that reviewing court as a Negro of African descent. His ancestors were pure of African blood and were brought into this country and sold as Negro slaves. And apparently given that right to due process, this arguably article encumbered in a peculiar institution of American slavery had prayed with his rights to that court for relief in judgment as to whether this court can or will take further cognizance of his rights to be recognized as a free person in the state of Missouri where he had been taken. And most of an enlightened mind today would agree that Dred Scott had that same right as Cinque and others of old the Amistad to be free, entitled to equal protection of the law. But the nation still yet, even enlightened and woke, remains divided on the question of whether a fetus is merely property and not a person, with at least an expectancy of life, and therefore not so entitled to some modicum of equal benefit of all the law and proceedings for security of persons and property as is enjoyed by America's white citizens. Since, in the popular mind, abortion is merely a medical procedure, a transaction in commerce, just as once long ago a slave was just an article for interstate commerce. And if a fetus could speak, as most certainly it cannot, no more than an animal, lacking sufficient level of development, might it, like one encumbered chattel property in commerce, before the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court rise to say, "Give me free"? Should it have that voice issued by others to speak those sentiments? What do you think? We'd like to know.
Yes, they all start talking as the men stop moving, and they all start fighting. And what have you got in the end?
This message was approved by Major Mike Webb. Honest.